Hello, my name is Kieran and welcome to my presentation on global climate change politics. And today I'm going to attempt to unpack some of the factors at play which influence the world stage of environmental politics. This presentation will go over some of the arguments put forward by the Week 7 paper Climate Change Politics by Professor Thomas Bernauer, as well as some secondary sources with some of my own ideas thrown in for good measure. The presentation has been split into 4 segments, number 1 being scaling the environment, giving some groundwork to the planet-sized issue at hand. Number 2 being the paradox of international cooperation with competing interests. Then I will contextualise with some environmental regimes, for which leads me to a conclusion looking forward and some thoughts around climate politics' current status. Between 1995 to 2015, there has been an increase in frequency of natural disasters experienced globally, injuring 4.1 billion people and taking 606,000 lives. The tipping point of anthropocentric impact on Earth's climatic conditions can be traced back to the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. While debate is rife on methods of how exactly we deal with this extinction level threat, it's revealed problems in our systems of governance. This is a threat that does not discriminate between man-made boundaries between states, nations, and regions. Several transboundary issues, such as the conservation of endangered wildlife, natural habitats, and marine life, have long been discussed as predominantly a regional or local matter in cause and effect. But it is now apparent the likes of deforestation, desertification, and water scarcity all have complex repercussions on an international level. This therefore reaffirms the dire need for environmental diplomacy on an international level. So I've decided to frame this presentation around some of the accompanying baggage of international treaties, initiatives and policies for which are currently in place. So it's pretty clear that the emission of greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels are causing changes to the Earth's atmosphere, which in turn increases global temperature. This is illustrated in the paper by the table displaying a 10-year moving average of surface temperatures over land. So, while we are ultimately at the mercy of nature, we have the opportunity at human agency to swerve away from the oncoming danger. This means we are really at the mercy of how we employ this agency through our systems of governance. And this is where politics comes into play. An analogy to the issue could be compared to the overhanging tree problem. Who is accountable for the area of tree when it encroaches upon a neighbour's land? Typically, there's a call to a higher authority through the local council, or perhaps they would seek expert legal advice to settle disputes between neighbours. Yet, comparing this to global climate politics, an overarching governmental power to regulate behaviour and levy taxes truly stop at a national level, creating a quite formidable sized power vacuum. There's no central sovereign authority in the international arena to coordinate policy responses to problems of the global commons, and no way to enforce the compliance with established agreements. And this turns the overhanging tree problem into the overhanging of many, many trees problem. For the agreement of a new regime or treaty represents a terribly difficult diplomatic task for collective action to be taken. And that's before considering the contents of the agreement. Is it binding? What are the nationally determined contributions? Partial agreements lead to implementation gaps and severely impact the effectiveness of the regime as a whole. Now I'll take a brief look at some milestones which have brought us to current international climate politics. The scientific consensus around the validity and urgency of climate change, combined with the growing demand for global cooperation, resulted in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as the UNFCCC, being created at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. It was an institutional framework set in place in efforts to reduce and stabilise greenhouse gas emissions, including an annual conference of parties, also known as the COP. The 1997 Kyoto Protocol, also known as COP3, was initially viewed as a milestone of progress to an effective global climate regime. It solidified legally binding GHG emission targets for developed countries amongst the chaos of political conflicts. While the commitments and sanctions were ultimately deemed as weak, they still represented a systemic shift to global cooperation in politics. Yet in 2001, President Bush withdrew from the protocol due to the exclusion of China and India for being needed to perform emission cuts. Ideas of tragedy of the commons most definitely reveal themselves here. It has led to some calling the Kyoto Protocol as a Kyotastrophe. Divisions from clashing core interests of economic development for both developing and developed countries further stifled progress in environmental democracy. This leads to a question. If collective action is necessary, should poorer nations be prepared to sacrifice their sovereignty to improve their influence? Institutionalists might argue that sacrificing sovereignty to a regime by the collective action it enables actually leads to more sovereignty for the poorer state. The transference of finance and technology as seen in the EU with the Green Climate Fund and the Multilateral Fund can in fact improve their sovereignty. The asymmetry of economic capability combined with the severity of damage experienced of different countries further serve characteristics of a prisoner's dilemma and tragedy of the commons logic. This creates a free rider problem. High economic output countries have a greater capacity to solve the problem of climate change, but therefore have the greatest opportunity at adaptation to environmental entropy. What should stop richer countries from adapting and capitalising rather than mitigating to aid others as well as themselves? It overall highlights the need for countries to transcend more short-term rationalistic tendencies. This leads to the question, if the ability to address climate change is dependent on having a large economic output, should emerging economies grow first and clean up later? In normal circumstances, I would split the class up into two groups, arguing for or against economic growth, and see what interesting conclusions we might come to. There are multiple uncertainties in both the political and technical sphere that slow progress. A climate-friendly government might attempt to lock down the country's future approach to climate policy by entering a legally binding global agreement. From a normative point of view, is this approach desirable if it's undemocratic and inefficient compared to a future approach? The costs and benefits of GHG mitigation options and effectiveness of future technologies could also prevent the commitment of policies in future. This gives rise to flexibility mechanisms to help mitigate these uncertainties by prioritising the most cost-efficient methods available. They are also less vulnerable to future inefficiency and locking a country into a particular technology. With ideal implementation, they help governments accept more ambitious reduction targets. But governments have been found to perceive flexibility mechanisms to tilt more to just softening targets, rather than to achieve the imperative of reducing emission targets. The global climate regime uses two types: joint implementation that have contracted greenhouse gas limits under the Kyoto Protocol, and the other for countries without GHG limits, known as the Clean Development Mechanism. Countries can sell excess emission rights to countries that pollute too much. This can be implemented through investment into emission reduction projects like reforestation or investment into renewable energy. The focus on systemic grouping of countries can ignore strong variation in niches within countries and some subnational units regarding their climate politics. The gloomy narrative on a global level that there is a lack of progress isn't necessarily true for some of these areas. It is easier, it seems, by the ratio of studies to research national or regional contexts like the European Union compared to researching international comparisons. These studies are critical to reforming climate policy. In some aspects, it might be beneficial for the variance of climate policy on a national level to allow experimentation of policies. But this depends on the other country's willingness to adapt if an optimal policy is identified. Political scientists are interested in explaining the variation in emissions between similarly developed countries by political factors like good governance and democracy. There is a mixed consensus, however, within the field on overall emission levels, but in certain contexts a democracy effect has been found on local air pollution. However, this might be due to advanced industrialized economies relocating their economic intensive activity offshore to poorer countries. But perhaps the focus might ought to be on politics' effect on poorer countries, with a relationship being found between involvement in international organisations by the number of memberships having lower greenhouse gas emissions. Perhaps the less economic agency a country has, the more politics becomes a significant determining factor. While there is a great deal more to talk about, I believe this presentation illustrates the diverse and challenging nature of climate change issues. It presents a turbulent atmosphere for political science to progress in both principles and methodology. It is a wicked problem that relies on the entire spectrum of social science to answer. There aren't a narrowly defined set of outcome variables like other mediums, as it really is a interdisciplinary, abstract issue. This also makes it just as challenging to make a presentation on. The search for concrete consensus at an abstract global level might not be found using the top-down approach of comparing big data, but rather, perhaps bottom-up. The micro level of measuring cost and benefit policy on an individual contextual basis might be a way forward if a generalization is too abstract to be meaningful. The focus on forming and strengthening environmental regimes while filling implementation gaps needs to be balanced by the recognition of environmental degradation beyond the reach of environmental diplomacy. However, rationalistic arguments which promote self-interest at all levels need to be moderated. Or perhaps there needs to be a redefining of the rationalistic concept of pursuing self-interest. Ideas of game theory of one government claiming victory over the other. In reality, self-interest actually requires the recipient to support the other countries to ensure a sustainable future for themselves and everyone. One country's self-interest is as much as everyone's self-interest. Thank you for listening.